Shalom from Israel. I'm Sorko-Ram reporting to you from Tel Aviv, and I want to welcome you to Israel Frontline, your guide to Israel and the Middle East. We want to give you a biblical perspective on political and social current events in Israel as they happen and why they happen. What you will hear on this program will contrast sharply with the biased reporting we're receiving from most of the world media. Today, we conclude our four-part series about the restoration of Israel. On this program, we will continue examining the Palestinian refugee dilemma, focusing on the reason why refugee numbers continue to grow. On the program today, background on Arab refugees. Are they really refugees? Are Palestinian refugees better off with all the massive financial help they have received? In the second part of the program, our panel guests will offer their views on the refugee issue. Following Israel's 1948 War of Independence, more than 900,000 Jews were forced to flee their homes in Arab countries. The Arab Muslim nations were furious at the creation of the new state of Israel and were taking their wrath out on the Jews living in their lands. At the same time, around 600,000 Arab refugees left their homes at the demand of their Arab leaders in what had now become the State of Israel. Many of them fled to Judea and Samaria, today called the West Bank, an area that the Jordanians seized and occupied for 19 years. Others went on to Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Gaza, the latter being part of Egypt at the time. All of these countries had and still have the same language, race, religion, and culture. But the refugees who arrived in these countries often settled in temporary camps that were to provide initial shelter to them. It's sad to note that today many of these camps still remain, and the descendants of those who were refugees 3 generations ago still live in those same camps. Don't be deceived. This is not out of choice. Until today, except for Jordan, no other Arab nation has allowed the Palestinian refugees to become citizens of their country. And then the Six-Day War took place when Egypt, Jordan, and Syria decided again to try to throw the Israelis into the sea. Instead, stunningly, in 6 days, Israel more than doubled her land size, but found that now another 700,000 Palestinians had come under the rule of the State of Israel. Although Israel did not expel Arabs from the newly acquired areas of Judea and Samaria, some 150,000 Arabs again fled, mostly to Jordan. But why are there still Palestinian refugees today? This is the fundamental question. Why are there still refugees today, almost 7 decades after the Independence War ended? The end of the 1967 Six-Day War and the departure of the Jordanians from the West Bank sparked a new movement, that of so-called Palestinian nationality. But wait, didn't they exist before? Did Palestinians only start speaking about a national home in 1967? If you ask Palestinian officials and pro-Palestinian historians, they will tell you the Palestinians were a national movement long before, centuries ago, in fact. The reality couldn't be farther from this myth. The Arabs living in the land in 1948 were part of the Arabs of the Middle East, who were a mix of tribes and clans from around the region. When Jordan conquered Judea and Samaria in 1948, no one ever thought of creating a state for the Palestinians. No one in Jordan, nor any of the Arabs living there called for the creation of a Palestinian state in Judea and Samaria. Jordan, occupying East Jerusalem during that time, never imagined naming that backwater town as the capital of a Palestinian people. The old city was in the Jordanian king's hands. He could have done it, but no one had conceived such an idea back then because at the time there was no Palestinian people. Therefore, the claim for Palestinian statehood in Israel with Jerusalem as its capital is an idea created only after Israel captured Jerusalem and Judea and Samaria from Jordan. It is important to note that 2/3 of Palestinian refugees live in normal Arab towns and villages, not refugee camps. But here's a question for you. Are the Palestinian refugees of this present day actually refugees? Well, if the definition of a refugee is that which is used around the world by the United Nations, except for the Palestinians, of course, the answer is no. In 1951, the UN held a refugee convention in which they defined who is a refugee and what should be done with them. According to the UN convention, a refugee is, and I quote, a person who is outside his or her country of nationality or habitual residence, end of quote. In other words, you are a refugee when you are not able to return to your home. But there is no mention of future generations. And most of those who are defined as Palestinian refugees today have never even been to Israel. The treaty also states that you are not a refugee indefinitely. Once you receive status in a country and can remain in it with relative safety, you're no longer a refugee. If we follow these guidelines, there are currently a maximum of 30,000 Palestinians who fled Israel in 1948 and are still alive. And even they should have received some type of status from the countries where they resided for generations. If they are treated like all other refugees, they would have ceased to be refugees. That's the plain truth. So what's going on here? The common perception of the Palestinian refugee issue simply does not add up to what the UN itself set as parameters for refugee status. Their own documents indicate that millions of so-called Palestinian refugees are not refugees at all. So what are the elements that allow the Palestinian descendants of refugees to universally be considered refugees, contrary to international norms and practices? First, there's UNRWA, which is the United Nations Relief and Work Agency for Palestinian refugees. Now, we've done an entire program on this issue, so I'll just say that the Palestinian refugees have their own personal UN agency with its own personal budget, 30,000 workers, and a 0 success rate. Yes, you heard me right. In over 60 years, the agency has not been able to take one refugee and help him or her not to be a refugee anymore. Rather than fulfilling their mandate, UNRWA has single-handedly caused the number of Palestinian refugees to balloon over the decades and has done nothing to help them move on in joining the Arab societies of which they've been a part for so long. Most importantly, Palestinian refugees have remained in limbo without rights in Syria, Lebanon, Egypt for decades. Jordan is the only country which has granted at least partial rights and citizenship to the refugees within its borders. It's true that back in its early days, the UN, with Israel's cooperation, worked endlessly to help these Arab refugees find permanent homes in sparsely populated countries like Syria and Iraq. But all of the Arab nations saw the refugees as its ultimate weapon to destroy Israel. Here's one of hundreds of examples. A Syrian refugee conference in 1957 passed the following resolution: any discussion aimed at a solution of the Palestine problem will not be based on ensuring the refugees' rights to annihilate Israel, will be regarded as a desecration of the Arab people and an act of treason. And until today, the world asks nothing of the Arab Muslim nations to change their ideology and just accept the existence of their neighbor, the Jewish state of Israel. They simply demand that Israel solve the problem. Everything we've discussed so far is both confusing and depressing. Why would countless nations around the world promote policies that have been causing suffering to the Palestinian refugees that have lasted almost 70 years? What incentive would they have to spend billions on organizations like UNRWA that keep generation after generation in refugee camps with little hope of a better future? There's no logical reason for this. Search all you want and you will not find one. The answer is found elsewhere. There is a battle against Israel, against God's promise to return his people to his land and through them establish his kingdom, first in Jerusalem and then to the ends of the earth. Those who oppose God are willing to literally sacrifice the future of the Palestinian refugees to ensure they are forever a threat that could one day obliterate the state of Israel. The day Israel would be forced to allow millions of Palestinians to move into our country, as every Palestinian Authority government since Yasser Arafat has demanded, would be the day we cease to exist as a Jewish and democratic state, simply by being outnumbered and thus outvoted. For the Palestinian leadership, that's what it's all about. When you say Palestinian, think Islamic. There is no democratic Islamic Arab state in the world. We know that there are many surrounding Islamic states who are intent on destroying our nation, but God knows the beginning and the end. Through Isaiah the prophet, he said, "Behold, all who are incensed against you shall be put to shame and confounded. Those who strive against you shall be as nothing and shall perish. You shall seek those who contend with you, but you shall not find them. Those who war against you shall be as nothing at all." Please stay with us. We will be right back with our panel of Israeli guests.
One of Maoz's major activities is hosting nationwide conferences for Messianic believers and leaders in Israel. Events like Equip Conferences for Leaders, the Israel-China Kingdom Destiny Conference, and Promise Keepers conferences help Israeli believers grow in faith and advance our vision. These conferences also establish strong connections within the worldwide body of Messiah and provide tools to reach the lost, from Jerusalem to the ends of the earth.
Welcome back to Israel Frontline. Our panel will now address the issue of Palestinian refugees and offer their Israeli perspectives. Today in the studio with me are Mati Shoshani, Director of Operations for TBN Israel, Shani Ferguson, co-founder of Yeshua Israel Ministries, and Albert Wexler, Deputy Director of Global Aliyah. And they are all from Jerusalem.
Best city in the world.
Thank you.
A lot of people seem to think that way.
Mati,
Yeah.
the Palestinian refugees in Judea and Samaria have never built the infrastructure that a state needs. At least that's my understanding. You can correct me
That
if
is
I'm
correct.
wrong. They haven't built the roads, waterworks. Even Israel does the tax collection for the Palestinian authorities. I've never quite figured that one out. They didn't develop a democratic justice department, any of that. Israel has had to supply much of the infrastructure for the Palestinians in order for the Palestinian Authority not to collapse. My question, why has the Palestinian Authority not built their own infrastructure?
Okay. That's a really, I'm going to try and compact my answer. One, people need to understand that between 1948 and 1967, when Israel took over what is known as the West Bank or Judea and Samaria, it wasn't the Palestinian Authority. That entire region was part of the state of Jordan that illegally acquired it. So that's very important. Before 1948, and this is also a really important point, the Jews in the land, in Israel, or Palestine at the time, what they did was gear up, prepare for building a state. We're talking financially speaking, institutes, government, everything that you need for a state, they were doing that. There were no Palestinian people back then. That idea of having a Palestinian state didn't exist at all. In 1948, it didn't exist, and throughout the Jordanian rule of that area, it didn't exist. So the point is, the Jordanians between 1948 and 1967 really didn't invest much in what was under their control.
I wonder
and the Jewish
why.
side, why? Because they were a poor state, generally speaking.
Mati, I want to correct something here.
Okay.
Actually, the 1947 UN resolution mentioned the Arab state and the Israeli Jewish state. So the idea was actually discussed. But
You mean the partition plan that
Exactly.
that was denied by all the Arab parties and accepted only by the Jews?
correct.
So
but
it's,
it was mentioned. So when we talk about this, you have to remember that the Jordanians, when they illegally, as you mentioned very correctly, took over the Judea and Samaria, only two countries in the world, United Kingdom and Pakistan, basically recognized the Jordanian annexation, because they annexed the so-called West Bank. This is actually where the word comes from.
Because the point was that Jordan was never a party to these discussions.
Exactly.
They're an external force. The Jews actually had a right to a portion of the land. The Jordanians were a foreign party that came in and took over
But
the
the
land.
good question is, why didn't they, during these 19 years that it was under the Jordanian rule and annexed to Jordan, why didn't they then create the Palestinian state? Well, a simple answer. You don't need two states for one nation.
That's a really good point. I want to elaborate on that because that's really important. Is that the people might not know that Jordan today, and also back then, is a majority Palestinian state. The ruling party, which is the Hashemites, King Hussein, King Abdallah, and then his sons, and so on and so forth, these people are a small Bedouin minority in the country, which is predominantly, till this day, a Palestinian
So the
country.
king is from a Bedouin background,
Yes.
whereas the citizens of Jordan are mostly Palestinian.
Well, a majority of the citizens.
Okay,
of
but
Jordan,
then
yeah.
what you're saying is that there's a Palestinian people that live in Jordan, which isn't completely accurate because you've now
Well, there
decided
were
that there
Arabs
is a
that
people.
lived in this region.
Okay, so the
pre-1948,
same Arabs that
yeah.
lived in the
Then
Jordanian
there was
area
also
that lived
the
in the.
Yeah.
refugee thing that they moved because of the Arab
Correct.
armies. The Arab High League announced that they would clean up the land and they would give the Jewish homes to the Arabs when the victorious Arab armies would come in 48, 49, but of course they lost the war. Another thing also is, which is important, that in the Palestinian Liberation Organization, and they call it Palestinian Liberation Organization, was started in 1964, before the Six-Day War. So they...
But again, they weren't started in this area at all. They were started outside of the country.
Egypt, yeah. But they saw this whole piece of land that the Jewish people had now after the partition plan in 1948, they saw this as Palestine that they need to liberate. So,
Well, you're using past tense, so they still see it as Palestine that they need to liberate.
Sadly.
Yes, till this day.
But the point is that they never really thought about creating infrastructure, as you mentioned,
Okay,
in
why?
this place, because
Why
they
did they not?
they never saw this part of this British mandate as their state. They always saw the whole land of the British mandate as Arab.
Okay.
That's why they didn't agree with
Let's
the
talk about
partition plan.
the practical
That's
elements
why they
of
came
it.
to the war.
Let's talk about the
That's
practical
why.
element. We're talking from the 1920s, the Jews in this country were organized. They were educated, they had a plan, they had people with a plan, they had a whole structure of government. So when 1947, 1948 came around, it was bang, like that. They already had everything in place. And the Palestinians in the land, the Arabs in the land, didn't have any of that. Fast forward to present
Which isn't
day,
to say they were stupid, because sometimes people hear
No, they were not-
educated and
educated
think
does
they
not
mean
mean smart.
It means they had certain skills
Educated
of building
means they
infrastructure.
understood Western
Right.
government. And here's what happened in 1993, 1994, the Oslo Accords. Israel handed over control of much of the West Bank cities, so predominantly Arab or Palestinian, what we call today Palestinian cities, to the Palestinian Authority.
Who
And
did?
Israel did, as part of the Oslo Accords. And to date, they have not developed those cities. And the reasons to that, no one likes saying this, is huge amounts of corruption inside the Palestinian Authority. They received a lot of money, and a lot of it just went into the pockets of corrupt leaders.
$1 billion US dollars in Arafat.
And it's also, I mean, the same thing happened down in Gaza, because like you give concrete,
this
they
is-
don't build anything except for tunnels and rockets.
I mean,
and
proportionally speaking, there has never been people in the world, in the history of the modern world, who received so much money per person
Yes.
and can show so little for it.
25 times more than the
It's-
Europeans
yeah, I think it's a
received
lot
during
more
the
than-
Marshall Plan. 25 times
So you're
more.
saying that the Palestinians have received 25
Palestinian
times
leaders,
No, it's
not
Palestinian-
Palestinians.
The
Palestinian
authority.
leaders, yes.
has received 25 times more than the Europeans did
In the
for the
Marshall Plan.
Marshall Plan after
cap-
World War II.
Per capita, and that statistic was relevant 3 years ago, so now it's much higher because they've continued to receive money since then.
Recently, 500 million just disappeared. No
Yes.
accountability. So the money just disappears.
Disappeared.
Yeah, corruption is widespread, and they have a serious problem that a lot of their money gets spent on just paying salaries without actually anything to show for it. Many projects, for instance,
European
there are
taxpayers.
places where you'll have a sign that say
American
50.
taxpayers.
Yeah,
Why are they
American,
exempt?
Japanese. You'll have a sign that'll say the Japanese, and this really exists, donated 50 million for a water purification plant, and twice the money has been donated. There's nothing to show for it. So a lot of
Okay.
money just disappears.
Okay, so I have a question. What if today, tomorrow morning, we have a Palestinian state like the United Nations is demanding, like the America is demanding, and so is Europe? What if we had, tomorrow morning, a Palestinian state? What would it look like? What would happen there?
Well, Shira, first of all, it's non-viable. That's number one. But secondly, there's another danger because when we talk about the state, then there is a whole new set of laws, the international laws for a state or for a entity, or Palestinian, like Palestinian autonomy, chairman. It's a whole new set of laws, and it's a whole different situation. So, and it's impossible to reverse it. Until today, to the date, there has never been a state called Palestine in this area. So,
Or any other area?
This is a really problematic discussion, and just excuse my bluntness, because de facto, in reality, on the ground right now, and this has been going for 20 years, there has been Palestinian control over much of the Palestinian population. They've had government, they've had control. The result hasn't been very good. If you ask me, and I always say this, there is need for more international help, and by help I don't mean just cash handed over. I'm talking about supervision and direction in a fatherly and kind way in the right direction as a
You
people.
really think that would work?
Listen, I mean, there are cases in history. I mean, if you just hand over money, people do whatever they want. If you just support an idea, I mean, there's so much at play here. It's not just a purely
It
financial.
reminds me a
political
little bit,
question.
though, of the leadership that kind of feeds off the Black American culture, where it's like, as long as they keep them victims, as long as they keep them, feeling like they're down and oppressed, and they're always looking to this leadership. As long as the Palestinian leaders have this perpetuated refugee status, they're always going to just need more help and need more money, and they can line their pockets. The minute
That's
they're
the
a
thing. It is a
country,
huge money.
then they have to do something.
I'm going to add something more than money. I've heard many times, and I sort of believe it. The Palestinians do not want a Palestinian state. They do not
but
want
very
two
much for
states.
this reason.
What they want is to destroy Israel. And I feel like
that's
their
Palestinian leadership.
energy.
Palestinian
Yes,
leadership.
excuse me. Yes,
But
the
you should, and
Palestinian-
also, there are Palestinians that would not be eligible to live in the Palestinian state once those lines are drawn. So there's just a lot of sticky
There is
stuff and a lot of things that
very
wouldn't be resolved.
Clear stand, right? That they don't want any Jews live in this state.
Yes.
So it's a Judenrein situation.
Yes.
I mean, if any country in the world would say, we don't want any Jews to live in our country, in our state, what would they be called?
Well,
Nazi Germany.
they would be called Saudi Arabia or Qatar.
Yeah. Or any of the Arab states that expelled the Jews in the 50s.
Yes.
That would be, you know.
You know, one of the terms that's always used is illegal occupied Palestine. The Palestinian authorities have learned how, if you say a lie enough times, people will believe it. And I noticed that when one of those speakers, one of the Palestinian authorities gets up and talks, he always says illegally occupied Palestine, and he'll say it over and over and over in the same speech.
If it is occupied, then you should always ask from whom. Because
whom?
exactly, Jordan takes and occupies the territory
Illegally.
And
because
annexes
Israel
it.
and Israel
Annexes it.
conquering it is actually not illegal because of that.
That
It's
makes
very
it
problematic.
disputed territories.
Disputed territories.
Because when we talk about
what it really
peace talks or negotiations, then I mean, if Israel occupied these territories, from whom? Should we turn it back to the Jordanians? They don't want it.
Yes. Well, thank you for watching. We hope the information you hear on our program will give you insight into Israel's struggles to survive. If you would like to obtain a written copy of the entire 4-part series about the restoration of Israel, please go to maozisrael.org/restore for your free copy. We will also send you monthly articles that I have written in the Maoz Israel Report. Please remember to join us next week for another episode of Israel Frontline. On behalf of our team and myself, blessings from Tel Aviv.